Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we're traveling back in time to a story that isn't about sleep, but about a community that fell into a waking nightmare. It's a story about fear, suspicion, and what can happen when panic takes complete control. So before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into dark history, please take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate the content we explore here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see this global community we're building. All right, it's time. Dim those lights, maybe get a warm drink, and let's explore the chilling true story of the Salem Witch Trials together. During the frigid winter of 1692, Salem Village in Massachusetts was gripped by more than just the cold. An atmosphere of unease, distrust, and a silent dread filled the wooden houses and icy fields. The residents were devout Puritans, known for their rigid beliefs and profound superstition. They felt they were establishing a sacred settlement in a wild land, a city on a hill that God observed and the devil hunted. Their existence was already fraught with hardship. The village was still recovering from a bitter separation from Salem town over matters of church and governance. Harvests had been poor. Deadly smallpox outbreaks had struck nearby. Conflicts with local native tribes had left deep emotional scars on the community. Personal disagreements between villagers, arguments over land, and a powerful animosity towards anyone perceived as different or an outsider festered. Combined with the bleak, isolating New England winter, the community was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. That spark ignited in the house of the village pastor, Reverend Samuel Parris. His young daughter, 9-year-old Betty, and his niece, 11-year-old Abigail Williams, started exhibiting alarming behavior. They would shriek without reason, hurl objects, and twist their bodies into painful-looking positions. Sometimes they would become mute for long stretches, staring blankly in apparent horror. Whispers circulated among neighbors that the girls were bewitched. The girls themselves insisted unseen spirits were assaulting them, pinching and biting their skin. A perplexed Reverend Parris summoned Dr. William Griggs. Unable to identify any medical reason for the fits, Griggs offered a terrifying explanation that would unleash mayhem upon the village: witchcraft. This one word ignited the anxieties that were already bubbling just beneath the surface in Salem. In a world where the devil's servants were considered a tangible and present danger, the diagnosis seemed horrifyingly plausible. If Satan could infiltrate the minister's own family, then surely no one in the village was safe. Encouraged by the adults and their own peers, the girls started to identify their supposed tormentors. Their first targets were women at the very edge of society, the unwanted and the outcasts. However, the accusations would not stop there. They would soon spread to include the well-regarded, the affluent, and even the most devout members of the church. Salem was a small place, but the events unfolding there would resonate far beyond its boundaries. What started as quiet, fearful rumors would escalate into public executions and forge a dark legacy of mass panic that remains a stain on American history. After the notion of witchcraft was planted in Salem, it grew relentlessly, much like an invasive vine, at first silently, then choking all life it encountered. The afflicted girls, including Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and newcomers to the group like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, seemed to gain confidence with every passing day. Their behavior became a public spectacle. They would go into seizures in the middle of legal proceedings, shriek during church services, and insist they could see sinister spirits lingering over certain townspeople. This was far beyond childish games. It was a dramatic, open performance that, most frighteningly, the community accepted as real. The initial targets were those who had no social standing or power. Sarah Good, a destitute woman who begged for food, was notorious for mumbling under her breath when people refused her, and villagers interpreted this as her placing curses. She smoked, was irritable with children, and generally failed to conform to the strict Puritan ideal of womanhood, making her a perfect suspect. Sarah Osborne was another outsider. She had avoided church for more than a year and had caused a local scandal by marrying her own hired hand after her first husband's death. Such a defiance of social norms made her an object of suspicion. Then there was Tituba, the Parris family's slave. Her origins in Barbados made her seem foreign and mysterious, and her stories and cultural background unsettled the villagers. After facing intense interrogation, which may have included physical violence, Tituba admitted to being a witch. Instead of providing closure, her confession opened a floodgate. She spun a vivid tale of a tall, dark figure, understood to be the devil, who commanded her to sign his book. She described seeing bizarre creatures, yellow birds, red cats, and phantom dogs. Most fatefully, she declared that she was not alone, that other witches were active in Salem. This was all the confirmation the authorities needed. With Tituba's confession, the dam of restraint broke. New accusations emerged almost daily. Villagers began pointing fingers at each other. Long-held resentments were repackaged as holy denunciations. Disagreements over land boundaries were transformed into claims of spectral attack. A suddenly sick animal was blamed on witchcraft. A fussy infant in church was seen as a sign of demonic influence. The terror became so contagious that even those who knew better were too afraid to object. Standing up for someone accused meant you could be the next one named. The safest course was to say nothing. In this way, the net of accusations grew wider, ensnaring the entire community in its grip. Rational thought was disappearing, replaced by unchecked mass panic. With the number of accusations soaring and the village descending into hysteria, the colonial administration intervened. The newly assigned governor, William Phipps, desperate to impose control, created a special court to handle the escalating crisis. This court was named Oyer and Terminer, taken from a French phrase meaning to hear and to decide. In practice, however, it became an assembly line for convictions based on terror. This court began its work in Salem town in June 1692, and it was not a typical court of law. Its procedures were hopelessly twisted by the prevailing panic. Most critically, it suspended the need for physical proof or credible testimony. In its place, the court permitted a much more sinister form of testimony: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was the claim by a victim that the accused person's ghost or spiritual form had harmed them. In simple terms, if someone testified that your apparition had appeared in their bedroom and tried to strangle them, this was accepted as valid proof in court. It made no difference if the accused person could prove they were miles away or even in church at the time. The court believed their spirit was independently carrying out the devil's commands. There was no way to question a vision in court. More importantly, it was impossible to prove it didn't happen. Young girls were suddenly elevated to the status of key witnesses. Their fits, screams, and choking gasps in the courtroom grew more dramatic with each trial. One accuser, Mary Walcott, would collapse into convulsions the instant an accused person was brought in. If the defendant looked at her, she would scream. If they looked away, she would scream with even more intensity. This dramatic display captivated the courtroom, and the judges, among them the prominent Judge Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted these displays as undeniable proof of guilt. There were no defense attorneys for the accused. The idea was unheard of in colonial New England. If you were accused, you faced the court entirely on your own. Denying the charges only caused the girls to writhe in manufactured pain. Admitting guilt, however, offered a chance to escape execution, but only on the condition that you implicated others. The entire system encouraged fabrications and penalized honesty. To make matters worse, the trials became a form of public entertainment. People journeyed from neighboring towns to watch the proceedings. The accused were marched into the courtroom in chains, appearing confused, destitute, and completely without power. Despite the public frenzy, some people had doubts. Quiet whispers suggested the girls were putting on an act. Some wondered why the accusations were always aimed at specific kinds of people, but few dared to voice these concerns publicly. To challenge the court was seen as challenging God himself. In Salem, logic had been abandoned, and the law was no longer a tool for justice, but a reflection of the community's deepest fears. The gallows on Salem's Gallows Hill took its first life on June 10, 1692. The victim was Bridget Bishop. She was already known for controversy, and her poor reputation made her a vulnerable target. She dressed in colorful red, managed a local pub, and had faced similar accusations of witchcraft in the past. At her trial, her neighbors claimed her specter attacked them at night, that infants fell ill after she visited, and that she owned puppets or dolls used for dark magic. She insisted she was innocent of all charges, but the court declared her guilty. She was taken to the bleak, exposed hill just outside the village. There was no final prayer, no show of compassion. The rope was tightened. The crowd looked on, and with that one death, the mechanism of execution was set in motion. More hangings followed in rapid succession. On July 19, 5 more women were put to death: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some of these women had been respected members of the church. The case of Rebecca Nurse was particularly stunning. She was an aged, devout woman who was well loved by her neighbors. The jury's first verdict was not guilty. However, facing intense pressure from the judges and the renewed fits of the accusers in the courtroom, the jury was forced to reconsider and changed its verdict. Nurse's last statement, "I am as innocent as the child unborn," was a haunting protest, but it was futile. The rope made no distinction between the guilty and the innocent. More executions took place in August. Then on September 22nd, the most brutal day of the trials, 8 people were executed at once. One of them was Martha Corey, who had been skeptical of the proceedings from the beginning. Her husband, Giles Corey, suffered a different, horrific end. He refused to plead either guilty or not guilty, a tactic to prevent his trial from proceeding. The court responded by using an archaic and brutal form of torture called peine forte à dur. Heavy stones were methodically stacked on his chest over a period of 3 days to force a plea. His only response, according to legend, was to demand more weight. He died under the crushing load. By the time the madness ended, 19 individuals had been hanged. 1 man had been pressed to death, and no fewer than 5 others had perished in the miserable conditions of the jails. Scores of people gave false confessions to spare themselves from the gallows. In total, over 200 people were formally accused. The gallows cast a dark shadow over Salem, not just physically on the hill, but metaphorically over the soul of the community. Fear had replaced the rule of law, and justice itself had been executed. While the public hangings drew the most attention, hundreds of other accused individuals languished in overcrowded, filthy jails, hoping for an acquittal or some divine intervention. The small jail in Salem was quickly overwhelmed, forcing authorities to send prisoners to jails in nearby Boston and Ipswich. There, they were often kept in chains, exposed to the cold, and given barely enough food to survive. Many of these prisoners were not social pariahs. They were ordinary townspeople, neighbors, spouses, parents, and even children. Their real offense was often nothing more than getting into a dispute with the wrong person or possessing property that someone else coveted. In instance after instance, private vendettas were masked as righteous accusations of witchcraft. If a farm animal strayed onto a neighbor's land and then fell sick, it was blamed on a hex. If someone declined to lend a tool, they were accused of cursing it. The story of Mary Easty, the sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, illustrates this perfectly. Easty was a pious mother of 7 with a strong reputation. The court initially set her free, but she was arrested again just days later when the afflicted girls renewed their fits and named her. This second arrest guaranteed her execution. In a final, moving letter to the court, Mary pleaded not for herself, but for the court to put a stop to these proceedings before more innocent blood is shed. Her plea was ignored, and she was hanged. The cruelty extended even to the youngest. Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was arrested and questioned by magistrates. Terrified and confused, the child confessed to being a witch. Her fearful, nonsensical answers were recorded as fact. She was imprisoned in irons for 8 months. By the time she was released, the child was psychologically shattered and never fully recovered. Pregnancy could offer a temporary reprieve, but not mercy. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John would be executed, was also convicted and sentenced to hang. Her execution was postponed because she was pregnant. This delay ultimately saved her, as the trials ended before her sentence could be carried out, and she was later freed from jail after giving birth. The accusations multiplied, feeding on themselves. Some prisoners, in a desperate bid to save their own lives, confessed and then named other innocent people to prove their cooperation. Whole families were dragged into the nightmare. No one was safe. All the while, the jails grew dangerously full. Sickness was rampant, food was limited, and some prisoners died in custody before they ever even had a trial, trapped in a legal no-man's land. In the Salem of 1692, your character or reputation no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was whether someone was willing to accuse you. As autumn arrived in 1692, the powerful grip of the hysteria finally started to weaken. This change didn't come from a sudden return to logic within the court, but from the accusers pushing their luck too far. The critical shift happened when the accusations became too ambitious. Individuals who had previously endorsed the trials now found themselves targeted. Reverend George Burroughs, who had once been the minister in Salem, was arrested and accused of being the witch's primary leader. He was an intelligent, articulate man whose prior conflicts with powerful local families made him a target. On the day he was to be hanged, Burroughs did the unthinkable. Standing on the scaffold, he recited the Lord's Prayer from start to finish without a single error, a feat that everyone believed was impossible for a witch. The crowd was stunned into silence. Some began to cry. Even the most zealous supporters of the trials were visibly disturbed, though the hanging proceeded as planned. That event sowed a powerful seed of doubt. The final straw came when an accusation was lodged against Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself. The panic had now reached the highest level of colonial society. Governor Phipps, who was already growing concerned about the increasing criticism and disorder, was spurred to act. In October 1692, he formally dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which immediately stopped all trials and executions that were in progress. The mood of the public was changing. Clergymen who had previously remained quiet or even supported the trials began to voice their objections. Increase Mather, one of the most influential religious leaders in the colony, openly condemned the court's reliance on spectral evidence. He wrote that it was better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This was a revolutionary idea in a community that had spent months doing the exact opposite. The same people who had gathered to cheer at executions now began to express their doubts. Although the prisons remained packed, the thirst for more executions had faded. Too many well-regarded people were now in danger. Too many innocent victims were already in their graves. The community was slowly realizing that what they had witnessed was not God's justice, but a form of collective insanity. The flow of new confessions stopped. Some of the original accusers began to retract their stories, while others faded from public life. Those who had been the most vocal supporters of the trials now avoided eye contact. The fear was still present, but it had burned itself out. The public craved a return to normalcy, and the officials needed to repair their reputations. Salem, wounded and deeply ashamed, was at last emerging from its dark delusion. The fever was breaking, but the destruction was complete. By the end of 1692, the legal framework that had enabled the panic began to buckle under the strain of its own irrationality. After the court of Oyer and Terminer was shut down in October, a new, more careful court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was established in early 1693. This new court operated under very different rules. Most importantly, spectral evidence was forbidden, and the new judges were far more critical of the accuser's fantastical stories. The effect was immediate. The rate of convictions plummeted. Many of the accused were found not guilty and set free. Out of 56 cases tried by the new court, the vast majority were acquitted. Even individuals who had previously confessed to witchcraft started to take back their statements, explaining that they had only lied because of fear, coercion, or even torture. The theatrical fits of the afflicted girls no longer held sway over the courtroom. A key moment that demonstrated the trial's absurdity was the suspicion falling upon Reverend Samuel Willard, a highly esteemed minister. Although he was never formally indicted, the very idea that such a pious and prominent man could be accused showed everyone how random and broken the system had become. The same court system that had been so bloodthirsty was now acting with extreme caution. It began to quietly free the remaining prisoners. At first, they released those against whom there was little evidence, and later they even freed those who had confessed while under extreme pressure. In the meantime, the families of those who had been executed started to seek justice. The children of John Proctor filed a petition to have their father's property restored. The family of Rebecca Nurse began a long fight to have her name officially cleared. Over time, the community's overwhelming fear gave way to a deep and lasting sense of shame. Church communities were broken, with members unable to worship alongside those who had accused them or their loved ones. Lifelong friendships were permanently destroyed. The entire social structure of Salem had been torn to pieces. Governor Phipps, aware that the colony was becoming a source of ridicule and horror internationally, issued a pardon for all remaining prisoners in 1693. But this freedom was not without a final cruel price. Many families were required to pay the jailer's fees for their loved ones' imprisonment before they could be released. It was a final indignity to lose everything and then be billed for the experience. When the dust finally settled, 19 people had been executed by hanging, 1 man was crushed to death, 5 more had died in prison, and more than 200 people had seen their lives ruined by accusations. The court system had not just failed, it had self-destructed, leaving behind a void filled with guilt, sorrow, and confusion. The trials were over, but the recovery process was nowhere in sight. Salem was a village scarred forever by the lives it had taken, the justice it had denied, and the terrible reflection it now saw of itself. The hangman's rope no longer swung, and the prison cells were vacant, but tranquility did not return to Salem. The village was now haunted not by specters, but by a profound sense of guilt. An episode that began with a few ailing children had erupted into a devastating wave of communal self-destruction. Families were fractured, names were permanently stained, and innocent people were dead. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their broken community. It became impossible for neighbors to face one another, knowing that people who had once worshipped side by side had sent each other to the gallows. Several of the original accusers quietly moved away, while others simply retreated from public life. A handful, like Ann Putnam Jr., eventually showed regret. In 1706, she stood up in her church and offered a public apology for her part in the tragedy, claiming she had been deceived by Satan. For most, however, the harm was too deep to be fixed with words. The officials involved in the trials also reckoned with their actions. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the key judges, was a rare exception who publicly acknowledged his error. In 1697, in an extraordinary display of humility, he stood silently in his church as his minister read his formal confession, in which he asked for God's forgiveness. It was a singular moment of public responsibility in an era when most preferred to bury the past. But moving on was not simple. The families of the victims began to fight for redress. For years, they sent petitions to the Massachusetts government pleading for official pardons, the restoration of seized property, and a formal declaration that their loved ones had been innocent. The government's response was slow and hesitant. In 1711, a bill was passed that restored the civil rights and good names of some of the victims, and it authorized limited financial payments to their surviving family members. But even this act was incomplete. Several families, including those of Giles Corey and John Proctor, were excluded from the bill. While talk of witchcraft faded across New England, the shame of the trials became an inseparable part of Salem's identity. Salem Village later changed its name to Danvers, possibly in an effort to create distance from its dark history. Gallows Hill was left unmarked for generations, as if the town wished to erase the memory of what had transpired there, along with the bodies. But the memory survived, in church sermons, in cautionary tales, and in the tense silences between former friends. Salem had not been attacked by witches. It had been poisoned by its own fear, arrogance, and the abuse of authority. That poison would remain long after the last victim was buried. The Salem Witch Trials concluded over 300 years ago, yet their impact still resonates, extending beyond history books and tourist sites to shape our modern understanding of justice, panic, and how easily truth can be distorted. The events of 1692 were not just a bizarre case of mass delusion. They represented a total collapse of reason, empathy, and the rule of law in the presence of overwhelming fear. Regular people, farmers, healers, and church leaders became complicit in executions because they believed what they were told and failed to ask critical questions. The very courts that were designed to shield the innocent were turned into weapons of persecution. Faith was used as a justification for cruelty. The courtroom was reduced to a stage for dramatic performances, and remaining silent was interpreted as an admission of guilt. One of the most frightening parts of the Salem tragedy is the speed at which it happened. Within just a few months, raw panic completely replaced rational thought. Deep-seated personal conflicts, dressed up as a holy war against evil, resulted in capital punishment. It did not require actual demons to tear the community apart. It only required the belief in them. However, this dark chapter also provided painful but valuable lessons that would profoundly influence American society. In the decades and centuries that followed, the memory of Salem was repeatedly used in arguments for legal protections and individual rights. The United States Constitution, drafted almost 100 years later, includes specific protections against the kinds of legal abuses that condemned the accused in Salem, such as the right to be represented by a lawyer, the right to confront one's accusers, and the insistence on tangible proof. These fundamental principles of justice were, in part, born from the terrible memory of Gallows Hill. Today, the term witch hunt is often used casually to describe any kind of political attack or moral panic, frequently overlooking the real-life horror the phrase represents. But Salem was not a figure of speech. It was a real place where real people were killed for crimes that did not exist, abandoned by the very institutions that should have protected them. Ultimately, the most enduring lesson from Salem may be that fear, when allowed to grow without limits, can become its own kind of oppression. And when that fear is given the stamp of approval by powerful institutions, by courts, by churches, or by governments, it becomes nearly impossible to stop. The Salem Witch Trials serve as a timeless warning, not just about one community's spiral into chaos, but about the terrifying ease with which logic can be overthrown when panic is given power. The gallows are long gone and the courtrooms are silent, but the admonition remains. Truth is delicate, justice is not guaranteed, and history is prone to repeating its darkest chapters when we fail to remember them.